It was one of those weekends that felt unusually warm for the season, the kind of day that made you want to leave your house and explore the small, seemingly peaceful town. That's how I ended up at the yard sale down the block. It wasn't a planned visit. I'd been wandering aimlessly, with no specific destination in mind, when I saw the sign, "Yard Sale. Everything must go." Curiosity piqued. I decided to stop by. As I approached the house, I noticed the lawn was lined with old furniture, boxes, and random household items. It wasn't unusual for a yard sale to have a mix of things, but this one had an eerie feel about it. The house itself looked abandoned, though it wasn't. The peeling paint and overgrown bushes gave it a neglected, rundown look. The sale, though, seemed to be in full swing, with a few people browsing the items, their voices low and absent of the usual chatter you'd hear at such events. I made my way over to a table stacked high with old books and knickknacks, trying to ignore the sense of unease that had started to settle in my stomach. The man running the sale stood near the back of the yard, seemingly organizing more boxes. His presence was odd. Tall, dressed in a faded flannel shirt. His face weathered but blank, almost expressionless. His movements were slow, deliberate. There was nothing overtly menacing about him, yet something about the way he stood there, unmoving for long stretches, sent a chill up my spine. I didn't let my instincts stop me, though. After all, it was just a yard sale. What harm could there be? I began sifting through some old books. Their covers were yellowed, the pages brittle. Nothing here looked particularly valuable, but I enjoyed the quiet of it. Every so often, I'd glance up at the man. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, even when his gaze was fixed on the pile of junk he was organizing. Maybe it was just my paranoia, but it felt too intense to be coincidental. After a while, the small crowd dispersed. I was left alone with the man. The air around us thickened, and I could feel my heart rate quicken. There was something off about this whole situation. I forced myself to look away, pretending to be engrossed in an old radio on the table. It was only when I heard him clear his throat behind me that I realized how tense I had become. "Looking for anything in particular?" he asked, his voice gravelly but polite. I turned, smiling slightly, trying to mask my discomfort. "No, just browsing." He smiled back, but it wasn't reassuring. It was almost predatory, his lips curling just enough to show too many teeth. He took a step closer, and I noticed the subtle odor of something foul beneath his clothes, like he hadn't bathed in days. "Most people who come here find what they didn't know they were looking for," he said, his tone lowering slightly, the words hanging heavy in the air. I felt my stomach churn. Something about that statement felt wrong. I was about to excuse myself when his next words froze me in place. "I could give you something more interesting if you'd like. Something rare." His eyes gleamed with something I couldn't quite place, and I didn't like it. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity, always my weakness, held me in place. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I regretted it immediately. I knew I should just walk away, but now I couldn't. He gestured toward the back of the yard, where a small shed stood, partially hidden by a large, overgrown tree. "I have some things back there," he said, his voice lowering further. "Things I can't sell to just anyone." Despite my growing unease, I felt an overwhelming urge to follow him. I told myself it was nothing, just a strange man with a strange offer. I'd probably get a great story out of this, right? I nodded, trying to hide the anxiety creeping up my throat. "Sure, why not?" He led me toward the shed, and I couldn't help but notice how quiet everything had become. Even the birds had stopped singing. The air was thick, stagnant. When we reached the shed, he pulled the door open with a screech, revealing a dimly lit interior. It smelled musty, damp, and I instinctively took a step back. He reached in and flipped a switch, the dim light casting strange shadows across the walls. On one side of the room was a large, old-fashioned trunk, its brass locks tarnished with age. Next to it were a few crates filled with old bottles, jars of all shapes and sizes, and something covered in a tattered cloth. "Here," he said, beckoning me closer. "This is what I meant. This is something truly special. I stepped forward, my heart hammering in my chest. There was something about this whole situation that didn't sit right with me, but my curiosity won out. I wanted to know what was in that cloth. I reached out and grabbed the edge of it, pulling it away to reveal a small, ornate box. It was covered in strange carvings, the wood darkened with age, and there were stains, dark, reddish stains, that I didn't want to look too closely at. The man's hand brushed mine, and I pulled back instinctively, my skin crawling. "You like it?" he asked, a strange gleam in his eye. I tried to force a smile, but I couldn't shake the dread building in my stomach. "It's interesting," I said, my voice shaky. He smiled again, that same unsettling grin. "You should take it. No one else will understand its value." I wanted to refuse, but something in the pit of my stomach told me that this wasn't an offer I could just walk away from. As I stepped back, I glanced over my shoulder. There was something about the way he was watching me that made my skin prickle. I made up my mind in that instant. I had to leave. I quickly turned to walk away, but he moved faster than I expected, blocking the doorway. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice flat. "Yeah, I think I've seen enough," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but panic was creeping in. "Not so fast," he said, and I saw the change in his eyes. Something darker, more dangerous. He reached for my arm, but I reacted instinctively. I shoved past him, stumbling out of the shed, and ran. I could hear him calling after me, but I didn't stop. I bolted toward the street, my heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. I didn't stop until I was well past the yard, running blindly toward the main road. As I glanced back, I saw him standing in the yard, watching me with that same cold, calculating expression. I didn't look back after that. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest cafe, my chest heaving with each breath. My hands were shaking, but it wasn't over. A week later, I saw his face on the news. They had found him. The police had tracked him down after a tip-off from a neighbor. He had been a suspect in a string of disappearances from the area. And as it turned out, the strange box I'd almost taken, it had contained evidence linking him to his victims. I was lucky to have gotten out of there alive, but I couldn't forget the chilling feeling of his eyes following me as I ran, or the sense that I had barely escaped something far worse than I could have ever imagined. It was a Saturday morning, the kind where the sun hung low, casting a gentle glow over everything in sight. The street was quiet, with only a few cars passing by as I made my way down the block. A light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and the air was just cool enough to make you wish you'd brought a light jacket. It was the perfect day for a yard sale. I had no specific plan in mind, just wanted to see what people were selling, maybe find a few trinkets or some old furniture I could refurbish. I had done this before, hopping from one sale to the next, mostly out of curiosity and the hope of finding something rare. Sometimes it was an old lamp, other times a dusty book that seemed to hold a story of its own. I wasn't expecting anything extraordinary today. Yet, as I drove to the location listed online, I had an odd feeling. It wasn't much, just a quiet instinct that something felt off about this particular yard sale. As I pulled up, the house stood out, not in a good way, but in a peculiar sense. The grass was well kept, the driveway clean, yet there was something unsettling about the way everything was arranged. There were tables scattered along the lawn, each covered with mismatched items. Old clocks, chipped mugs, tattered books, broken picture frames. It looked like the kind of sale you'd expect from someone clearing out their attic. And yet, the place seemed too empty. I stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air, and walked up to the yard. There were a few other people milling about, inspecting items with the same casual interest as me. They didn't seem to notice anything unusual, but my eyes kept drifting back to the man at the center of it all, the seller. He was older, maybe in his mid-50s, with a scruffy beard and thinning hair. His clothes were old, but not in the vintage, charming way one might expect from a yard sale host. They were ill-fitting, as though he hadn't bothered to check the mirror that morning. His expression was blank, his eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that made me feel uncomfortable, as though he was watching each person too closely. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. But every time I glanced at him, I couldn't shake the thought that there was something wrong with him. He didn't greet anyone with the usual pleasantries of a yard sale host. He didn't ask if we needed help or if we were interested in something specific. He simply stood there, observing. I moved around the tables, pretending to be interested in an old bookshelf. The thing was a wreck, missing several planks of wood, and yet it was priced higher than I expected. I could feel the man's gaze on me, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I picked up a tarnished silver spoon from a nearby table, twirling it between my fingers, trying to act casual. Then I saw something that made me pause. A small, old-fashioned camera, sitting by itself on a weathered cloth. It was one of those vintage models with a viewfinder that made it look like something from the 1950s. I hadn't expected to find something like this. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the most expensive thing there, but there was something about it that caught my attention. Before I could pick it up, I heard the man's voice behind me, raspy and low. "You interested in the camera?" I turned, startled by how suddenly he had appeared. He was standing far too close, a strange glint in his eyes. "It's a good one," he said, almost as if he was trying to convince me. "Works like new. I've got the film for it too, if you need it." His smile was forced, unsettling. I nodded politely, but the feeling of discomfort was growing stronger. Something about the way he spoke, the way his eyes lingered just a bit too long, made me want to leave, but I couldn't quite explain why. "Yeah, I'm just looking around," I muttered, not wanting to seem rude. I moved away from him, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease. I tried to focus on the items in front of me, but my mind kept drifting back to that camera and the way the man had looked at me. He wasn't like the other sellers I'd encountered. He wasn't offering deals or trying to engage with potential buyers in any friendly way. He was just waiting, watching. As I moved along the yard, a couple more people stopped by, but the atmosphere didn't change. There was something eerily quiet about the entire scene. The others didn't seem to notice it, chatting about prices or asking questions about old furniture, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned the corner of the yard to another table, hoping to distract myself. The man's gaze followed me from the corner of my eye, and that's when I noticed something else, something even more unsettling. By the far end of the yard, tucked behind a pile of boxes, was a door. It wasn't just any door. It was an old wooden door, covered in dust, propped up against a stack of broken chairs. It looked out of place. No one seemed to acknowledge it. In fact, the people around the yard seemed to be avoiding it, stepping around it as if it were something they didn't want to look at. My curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the door, slowly, cautiously. As I approached, I could feel the man's eyes on me again. But this time, he didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. I reached out and touched the door. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally so. And there, at the bottom, was a faint stain. It was hard to see at first, but as I examined it more closely, I realized what it was. It looked like dried blood. Suddenly, I felt a jolt of panic surge through me. This wasn't just an ordinary yard sale. This wasn't just an eccentric man selling old things. There was something deeply wrong here. My heart began to race, and I instinctively turned toward the exit. But the man was already there, blocking my way. His expression was no longer friendly or neutral. There was something dangerous in his eyes now, something that made my stomach churn. "You should leave," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "It's better if you leave now." I froze. I had no idea what to do, what to say. My mind was racing, but before I could move, I heard a car pull into the driveway. The man's expression flickered, and just as quickly as he had appeared in front of me, he stepped aside, letting me pass. But I could feel the weight of his gaze on my back as I made my way to the street, every instinct screaming at me to run. I didn't stop. I didn't look back, and I certainly didn't go back to that house. I woke up early, the kind of early where the world feels still, untouched. The air was crisp, and I had a lazy Saturday in mind. Nothing too exciting, just the quiet satisfaction of exploring yard sales. I had seen the listing online, an ad promising vintage items, antiques, and rare finds. I wasn't expecting much, but a few hours of wandering through someone's old belongings always intrigued me. It was a couple of miles away, a small neighborhood on the edge of town. The streets were narrow, lined with old trees, and the houses were all pretty similar. Single-story brick homes with well-kept lawns. The house that hosted the yard sale stood out only because it was in the middle of a street that hadn't seen much traffic in years. I pulled into the driveway, and immediately, something didn't sit right with me. It was still early, too early for anyone else to be around, it seemed. The lawn was covered with tables, piles of knickknacks, and boxes stacked high with old clothes. Nothing too out of the ordinary, but the whole setup felt unfinished. The items were scattered haphazardly, as though someone had been rushing to get everything out before I arrived. I got out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway, and started toward the front porch where a table had a few random books piled up. The house behind me looked dark, quiet, as if no one had lived in it for a while. I'd seen this before. People trying to clear out things quickly, maybe moving, maybe selling off an estate. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. First, it was just the man, the seller. He stood by the table, hunched over, staring at me. He was wearing a plain black t-shirt, faded jeans, and worn-out sneakers. His hair was matted, long, and looked like he hadn't combed it in days. His face was hard to read. There was something unnerving about the way he stood there, like he wasn't quite sure whether to acknowledge me or not. "Looking for anything in particular?" he finally asked, his voice low, almost grating. I nodded, trying to shake off the sense of unease. "Just browsing," I said, forcing a smile. "Maybe some old books." He didn't respond, just continued staring at me. It wasn't the kind of look that felt friendly, but it wasn't hostile either. More like he was studying me, trying to decide if I was a threat or just another curious shopper. I shifted my weight, trying to look past him at the items around the yard. There were some old dishes on one table, a few vintage lamps on another, and a bunch of framed pictures on a third. As I moved to the picture table, I felt his eyes on me again. There were photographs of people, families, couples, children, but none of them looked familiar. There was a strange coldness in their eyes, like they were trying too hard to smile, and it gave me a chill. I picked up one photo, an old black and white image of a couple standing in front of a house. They were dressed in what looked like 1950s clothing, their faces smiling but stiff. As I looked closer, something about the man in the photo caught my attention. He looked almost too familiar. It wasn't the same man who was hosting the yard sale, but there was something in his eyes, something off that made my pulse quicken. I glanced up, and the man was standing right behind me. I hadn't heard him approach, but there he was, just inches away, too close for comfort. "Is there something wrong?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly again. I couldn't tell if he was mocking me or genuinely concerned. "No," I said quickly, setting the picture back down. "Just looking." I moved away from the table, trying to shake off the creeping discomfort. I was being paranoid, I told myself. It was just an old photo, nothing more. But the way the man was watching me, the silence hanging between us, made everything feel off. I turned to leave, but then I saw it. A small wooden box sitting on the corner of the table. It wasn't particularly fancy, just a simple box with metal hinges and intricate carvings along the edges. Something about it drew me in. I reached for it and noticed the seller's eyes following my every move. "You won't want that," he said suddenly, his voice urgent. "It's not for sale." I froze, my fingers still on the box. I had no idea why he'd reacted so strongly, but I couldn't let go. I lifted the box and felt its weight. It wasn't heavy, but there was a peculiar sense of unease that came with it. The man stepped closer, his face pale now, his hands trembling. "Please," he said, his voice cracking, "put it down." Against my better judgment, I opened the box. Inside, there was a small, faded notebook. The cover was cracked and worn, But as soon as I saw it, I knew something was wrong. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, but the words seemed distorted. They didn't make sense, like sentences were half-formed or missing. But what was most disturbing was the last page, which was simply a name. My name, written over and over again until the ink had bled through the paper. I dropped the box in shock, stepping back. The man's expression was frantic now, his hands raised as though he was trying to keep me from running. "You don't understand," he whispered. "You have to leave. Now." I didn't wait for him to say anything more. I turned on my heel and bolted for the driveway, the sound of my heartbeat thumping in my ears. I could hear him calling after me, but I didn't stop. I got into my car and sped off, not daring to look back. As I drove home, my mind raced. What had just happened? What was that box, and how did he know my name? I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong from the start, that the yard sale wasn't just a random collection of old things but something more sinister. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about the notebook. I had to know what was inside it. But as I reached for my bag to retrieve it from the car, my phone buzzed. I glanced down at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. "I warned you." My blood ran cold. Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying the content. As a college student, I work hard to create these videos, and I edit everything on my mobile phone. I'm hoping to upgrade to a laptop to improve the quality of my videos, but I don't want to ask for money directly. This Christmas, if you enjoy what I do, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could consider subscribing to the channel. It would mean the world to me. Your support helps me so much as I continue working toward my goals. Wishing you all a very Merry Christmas. May this festive season bring you joy and warmth. Thanks again for your support, and stay tuned for more.